In the federal courtroom of Dallas, Texas, a heavy silence settled as Judge John Carter struck his gavel, signaling the start of a tense trial. Jasmine Crockett, a Democratic Congresswoman and former defense attorney, entered with unmistakable confidence. She was representing James Carter, a whistleblower who had come forward against Charles Lawson, a wealthy developer accused of misappropriating millions in public funds for his personal ventures. With both a recorded confession and financial documents in hand, Crockett felt confident this would be a straightforward case. Pressure was nothing new to her, from defending low-income clients to advocating for justice as a lawmaker. Yet today felt different. At the defense table, an unexpected figure appeared. Karoline Leavitt, former White House press secretary under the Trump administration. Young but unyielding, she stood as a special legal advisor for Lawson's defense. Her involvement as a representative of the conservative establishment cast a chill across the courtroom. A press secretary in a courtroom? Crockett silently wondered, her expression tightening. She'd never encountered Leavitt before, but the association with Trump was enough to make her cautious. Before we dive deeper into the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the latest updates. The sharp echo of Judge Carter's gavel marked the official beginning of the trial in the Dallas courtroom. Jasmine Crockett stood from the plaintiff's table. Her curls were neatly set, and her eyes focused and determined. She straightened her blazer and walked confidently to the center of the room, a veteran of high-stakes legal combat. The audience quieted. The reporters stopped murmuring. All attention shifted to her. This was Crockett's moment, and she embraced it. "Your Honor," her voice rang out, calm yet firm. "I represent James Carter, a man who has bravely come forward to reveal the corruption committed by Charles Lawson." She held up a small USB drive, catching a glint of light as if holding a symbol of truth. This recording contains Lawson's own admission of misusing $5 million in Dallas taxpayer money for personal use. She turned toward the defense, where Charles Lawson sat expressionless, his narrowed eyes quietly assessing the situation. Crockett pressed on. "And that's not all. We also have financial records, bank statements, and contracts that clearly trace the flow of public funds into Mr. Lawson's private accounts. This isn't guesswork, Your Honor. It's direct, undeniable proof." She laid the USB and supporting documents on the table and locked eyes with the defense team. Judge Carter, his silver hair immaculate and his face stern, gave a slight nod. "Ms. Crockett, proceed," he said, his voice calm yet laced with interest. Crockett gave a subtle, confident smile. She had invested weeks preparing for this trial, scrutinizing every detail in the documents, every second of the recording. Lawson would not evade justice this time, she was sure of it. Then came a sudden sound, the creak of a chair, the sharp clack of heels across the wooden floor. Karoline Leavitt stood, her presence surprisingly commanding despite her petite frame. Lawson's lead attorney, Robert Clean, looked over in mild surprise, but Leavitt seemed unconcerned. She stepped forward with a slender stack of papers in hand, her eyes firmly set on Crockett. "Your Honor," Leavitt began, her tone cool and precise. "I'm Karoline Leavitt, serving as a special legal advisor at the administration's request. Before Ms. Crockett continues, I respectfully request a review of the authenticity of this so-called evidence." A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom, with reporters rapidly jotting notes. Crockett turned sharply, her expression hardening. "Are you serious?" she snapped, barely concealing her irritation. "You're a former press secretary, not legal counsel. This is a courtroom, not a press room." Leavitt didn't waver. Tilting her head slightly, she allowed a faint frosty smile. "Ms. Crockett," she said, her voice as calm as it was deliberate, "I don't need a law degree to recognize unstable ground. That recording, are you certain it's admissible?" Crockett blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She hadn't expected Leavitt to speak up, let alone challenge her so directly. Across the room, Lawson allowed himself a faint smirk, eyes gleaming as if spotting a lifeline. His once silent legal team began to shift, exchanging low murmurs among themselves. Judge Carter struck his gavel again. Order, he commanded, his sharp gaze moving between Crockett and Levitt. Ms. Levitt, if you have a point to raise, do so clearly. But remember, this is a courtroom, not a political platform. Levitt gave a slight nod, her eyes locked on Crockett. Understood, Your Honor, she replied, her tone composed, yet carrying an unsettling certainty. Ms. Crockett, proceed with your presentation, but I'd advise you to prepare yourself. Once I speak, you may not like what I have to say. Crockett's hands curled into fists. Her earlier sense of control now wavered as she looked at Levitt, the young blonde woman with unshakable eyes, and began to grasp that this was no ordinary adversary. The courtroom was still, the air tense, like a brewing storm. The battle had begun, and Levitt had just drawn first blood. Judge Carter struck the gavel once more, his voice firm. Ms. Levitt, you may state your point. There was a hint of intrigue behind his stern tone. Jasmine Crockett remained standing at the plaintiff's table, her hands resting on the documents, her gaze fixed on Caroline Levitt. It was still difficult to accept that someone with no legal credentials had just challenged her so openly. Levitt stepped forward, projecting quiet authority, her thin stack of papers held like a blade. Your Honor, she began smoothly. Ms. Crockett refers to this recording as irrefutable, but the question is it even legal? She turned to Crockett, eyes unwavering. Under the Federal Wiretap Act, 18 U.S. Code Paragraph 2511, a recording requires at least one party's consent. But in Texas, both parties must agree. Ms. Crockett, do you have legal authorization for this recording? Or did Mr. Carter make it without Mr. Lawson's knowledge? A hush spread across the room, broken only by the sound of pens scribbling in the press gallery. Crockett hesitated for a moment. She had carefully built her case, but this angle hadn't been part of her preparations. This recording was provided by a whistleblower, she countered, her voice still strong but a touch hurried. Federal law protects individuals like James Carter when exposing corruption. His actions fall under those protections. Leavitt tilted her head, her cold smile returning. An exception? She echoed, her tone slightly mocking. Ms. Crockett, I believe you're mixing up whistleblower protections with evidentiary procedures. The Whistleblower Protection Act, 5 U.S. Code, Paragraph 2302, guards Mr. Carter from retaliation, but it does not validate evidence obtained through unlawful means. She stepped closer, her expression firm. Do you have a court order for this recording? Or are you assuming justice will turn a blind eye to proper procedure? Crockett's hands tightened, nails digging into her palms. She could feel the courtroom's eyes on her, journalists, spectators, and especially Lawson, whose smirk had widened with quiet satisfaction. I don't have to answer someone without legal standing, she shot back, her voice raised slightly. You're a former press secretary, not a judge or an attorney. Levitt didn't flinch. Instead, she raised her papers slightly, like a weapon. I don't need a law degree to understand the law, Ms. Crockett, she replied steadily. And the law clearly states, if this recording lacks consent or a court order, it is inadmissible. I request its immediate exclusion from the case. A wave of murmurs swept through the back rows. Lawson's legal team, previously silent, began nodding and whispering among themselves. Robert Clean, the lead defense attorney, gave Levitt a glance of cautious approval. Lawson crossed his arms, eyes glinting. He could see a path forward. Judge Carter raised a brow, his tone cutting through the growing noise. Ms. Crockett, Ms. Levitt raises a serious procedural concern. How exactly was this recording obtained? Crockett drew a long breath, trying to steady herself. Your Honor, she said, her voice slowing, carefully choosing each word. James Carter recorded it during an internal meeting, where Charles Lawson himself admitted to wrongdoing. This was an emergency, and under Texas law, such recordings are permitted when made in the interest of public safety. Even as she said it, Crockett could feel the argument fraying. The absence of a court order loomed large, and Levitt had aimed right at that vulnerability. Leavitt gave a faint shake of her head, not in triumph, but as if disappointed. Your Honor, she continued smoothly, Texas law doesn't recognize a public interest exception, contrary to Ms. Crockett's invention. The statute is clear. Both parties must consent unless a judge explicitly rules otherwise. Ms. Crockett has no consent. No court order, therefore no admissible evidence. I urge the court to weigh that before wasting any more time. Crockett felt a flush rise in her face. She turned to Leavitt, her temper rising. You think you're clever? She hissed, her earlier composure crumbling. You're nothing but a mouthpiece for Trump standing here to defend a corrupt fraud. Leavitt didn't blink. Arms folded, she stood her ground, her voice low and cutting but calm. I'm not here to debate politics, Ms. Crockett, she replied. I'm here to uphold the law, and right now you're the one violating it. Judge Carter struck the gavel sharply. Enough, he said, his voice brooking no argument. Ms. Crockett, I need a direct answer. Do you have legal authorization for this recording? Crockett opened her mouth but faltered. She looked down at her stack of documents, then across to Leavitt. The young woman stood there, composed, piercing eyes locked on hers like a hunter waiting for the final move. And for the first time, Crockett felt her case begin to crumble. Judge Carter's gavel hit again. The silence in the Dallas federal courtroom felt taut, like a wire pulled to its breaking point. His tone turned to steel. Ms. Crockett, I asked a direct question. Does this recording have legal authorization? Crockett clutched the edge of the table, her eyes darting between the judge and Leavitt, the one who'd backed her into a corner with nothing more than confidence and a cold smile. She drew in a slow breath, trying to steady her voice. But, underneath, her frustration simmered. Your Honor, she began, the edge of emotion in her voice barely concealed. As I've said, this is evidence from a whistleblower, obtained during an emergency. It was meant to expose corruption. Justice should not favor criminals like Lawson. Leavitt didn't budge. Arms crossed, she turned to the judge. Your Honor, she said sharply, Ms. Crockett is evading the question. No court order. No consent. That's the plain truth. She can talk about justice all she wants, but the law doesn't run on feelings. I repeat, I move for the recording's exclusion. Crockett spun toward her, eyes blazing. You dare accuse me of dodging? She snapped, her hand trembling with rage. I've stood in courtrooms like this while you were still playing with dolls, Miss Leavitt. Who do you think you are, trying to lecture me about the law? The courtroom froze. The press stopped scribbling. Even the hum of whispering spectators fell away. Charles Lawson's smirk deepened, like a man savoring a performance. His legal team, led by Robert Clean, exchanged knowing glances. But Leavitt stood firm, unfazed, unflinching. She stood firm, petite in frame but exuding authority, as if Crockett's rising anger was barely a ripple in the air. Ms. Crockett, Leavitt responded, her voice low yet clearly audible. I don't need to teach you the law. You've already undermined yourself. She paused briefly before adding, but if you'd like to proceed, go ahead. Show us your next piece of evidence. I'm interested to see how weak it might be. Crockett felt heat rise to her face, stunned by what she saw as blatant arrogance. A press secretary, with no legal background, daring to challenge a seasoned defense attorney with decades in the field? She turned back to the table, hands unsteady, as she picked up the financial records. Fine, she said, her voice sharp and rising. You want to play? Then here. Bank statements and contracts. Funds flowing directly from public accounts into Lawson's hands. $5 million. Irrefutable. She slammed the stack onto the table, the sound echoing like a warning shot. Still, Leavitt didn't react. Instead, she stepped forward with a single sheet from her own folder, eyes scanning the documents intently. Your Honor, she began, her voice composed. Ms. Crockett just referenced contracts and financial statements. May I ask, was the subpoena for these documents properly issued? Because I have a copy here that suggests otherwise. Crockett stiffened, eyes darting to her own file. What flaw? She snapped. the strain in her voice evident. Levitt held up the paper, angling it toward the light to show a signature. "This subpoena," she said evenly, "was signed by a court clerk, not a judge. According to Rule 45 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, only a judge may authorize subpoenas in cases like this. Therefore, Ms. Crockett's documents are inadmissible, and I request their exclusion, along with the recording." A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Journalists scribbled quickly, some rising from their seats for a better look. Lawson folded his arms, his grin unmistakable. His lead attorney, Clean, leaned toward his team, nodding in quiet satisfaction. "You're fabricating this?" Crockett shouted, the last traces of composure gone. She moved toward the table, slamming her hand against the documents. "This is absurd. Who do you think you are?" she demanded. "A spokesperson, standing here and lying to protect a corrupt man?" Leavitt tilted her head, her expression cold. "I'm not making anything up, Ms. Crockett," she said flatly. "I'm simply pointing out what you overlooked. Verify it if you wish, but I recommend calming down. You're losing your credibility." "Order," Judge Carter commanded, his gavel hitting with force that echoed through the chamber. "Ms. Crockett, control yourself. Ms. Levitt, bring the document forward." Levitt stepped to the clerk's desk and handed the paper over, her demeanor unshaken. Crockett stood frozen, breathing heavily, gripping the edge of the table as if to keep herself upright. She looked at Levitt, the young woman with calm eyes and unshaken confidence, and for the first time in her career, felt a sense of helplessness. Judge Carter reviewed the document, his brow furrowing as he read. "Ms. Crockett," he said, slowly, "Ms. Levitt is correct. This subpoena is missing a judge's signature. Do you have an explanation?" Crockett opened her mouth, but nothing came. She looked down at her own paperwork, then back at Levitt, who stood steady, as if she had anticipated every move. Crockett had brought recordings and financial evidence, but Levitt, with just a few precise statements, had dismantled it all. "She can't do this," Crockett murmured faintly, her voice nearly lost. But the facts were clear. Levitt wasn't merely contesting the case, she was gaining ground. Judge Carter's gavel struck again. "I'll review Ms. Levitt's motion," he announced sternly. "Ms. Crockett, if you have further evidence, present it now, but keep your composure." Crockett remained silent, her gaze locked onto Levitt, filled with frustration and disbelief. She had lost control, and the entire courtroom had seen it. The confrontation had escalated, and Levitt had just gained the upper hand with precision no one had anticipated. The federal courtroom in Dallas was engulfed in an oppressive silence, interrupted only by Jasmine Crockett's uneven breathing. Echoing faintly through the chamber, Judge John Carter held the paper Caroline Levitt had just submitted, his brow furrowed as he scanned its contents. His eyes shifted, first to the document, then to Crockett, and finally to Levitt, who stood composed as if unfazed, with an air of calm control. Crockett clung to the table's edge, her fingernails digging into the wood in a desperate attempt to steady herself after the confrontation. But deep within, she felt her grip on the situation slipping away. "Ms. Crockett," Judge Carter said slowly, his voice firm and deliberate, "Ms. Levitt has pointed out that the subpoena used to obtain your financial documents was not authorized by a judge. That is a serious matter. Do you have an explanation?" Crockett drew in a deep breath, trying to suppress the fury boiling inside her. She turned toward Levitt, her expression a mix of anger and unease. "Your Honor," she began, her voice quivering yet attempting to remain composed, "the subpoena was issued under emergency circumstances. A court clerk signed it to expedite the investigation into corruption. That doesn't invalidate the evidence. The facts remain. Charles Lawson misappropriated public funds." Levitt gently tilted her head, a faintly knowing smile reappearing. "Your Honor," she interjected smoothly, her tone calm and measured. "Ms. Crockett is attempting to rationalize a critical procedural error. Rule 45 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure is unambiguous. Only a judge has the authority to issue a subpoena in such cases. A clerk's signature holds no legal validity, and she is fully aware of that. Crockett responded instantly, her voice rising with frustration. "She's distorting everything," she exclaimed, pointing an unsteady hand at Levitt. "This isn't about red tape. It's about justice. Lawson is guilty, and I refuse to let her manipulate the process to protect him." Judge Carter struck his gavel, the sound sharp and resounding. "That's enough, Ms. Crockett," he said sternly. "I'm not interested in emotional arguments. I want legal facts. Ms. Levitt, continue." Levitt nodded, stepping forward with a composed confidence that seemed to cut through the room. Raising one hand slightly, she spoke with calm precision. "Your Honor," she said, voice firm and clear, "I'm not only asking for the exclusion of the financial documents due to a procedural flaw, I'm also asking the court to reevaluate the admissibility of the audio recording that Ms. Crockett has relied so heavily on. I have legal precedent to support this request." The courtroom went completely still, every gaze fixed on her. Levitt pulled out another paper from her files, the bold heading catching the light. "In United States versus Nixon, 1974, she began, voice steady as if delivering a lecture. "The Supreme Court determined that evidence obtained unlawfully, regardless of its relevance, must be excluded if due process is violated." She paused. "Ms. Crockett's recording lacks both consent from Mr. Lawson and a judicial order. That renders it inadmissible under this precedent." Crockett's heart raced. "United States versus Nixon," she murmured, her voice barely audible. She knew the case well. Every attorney did. But hearing Levitt, a press secretary with no formal legal credentials, cite it with such precision sent a chill down her spine. Levitt held her gaze on the judge, unwavering. "Your Honor," she concluded, "neither the financial documents nor the recording meet legal standards for admissibility in this court. I request the immediate exclusion of all contested materials," Levitt declared firmly. "And if Ms. Crockett has no further admissible evidence, I propose we end this trial to avoid wasting the court's time." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously, some rising to snap photos. Charles Lawson leaned back with his arms crossed, his grin shining like a noon sun. His lead attorney, Robert Klein, nodded with visible pride, exchanging looks with his team, their expressions reflecting a mix of surprise and admiration. Crockett stood frozen, as if someone had struck her. Her eyes dropped to the documents in her hands, once her weapons, now exposed as fragile. Then she glanced at Levitt, the young woman radiating a quiet dominance far beyond her small frame. "She can't," Crockett whispered, her voice trailing off. She turned toward the judge in desperation. "Your Honor, this is a setup," she insisted, raising her voice. "She's defending a corrupt man by distorting the law." Judge Carter raised a hand, silencing the room. "Ms. Crockett," he said, his tone now cold, deliberate, "I've heard enough. I'll review the evidence and the arguments from both parties." He turned to Levitt, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Ms. Levitt, are you confident in your presentation?" Levitt didn't hesitate. "Absolutely, Your Honor," she replied, steady and calm. "The law doesn't favor anyone. It must be applied with integrity. That's all I've done." Judge Carter exhaled heavily, setting down the papers. His eyes swept across the courtroom, the restless press, the murmuring crowd, Lawson's beaming face, before settling back on Crockett. "I'll need time to deliberate," he said slowly. "But I must admit, Ms. Levitt's argument is exceptionally strong. Unless you have further legally sound evidence, this will be very difficult for you." Crockett felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. Her lips parted to respond, but no words emerged. She turned toward Levitt, her eyes filled with a blend of rage and helpless disbelief. Levitt remained at the defense table, arms crossed, her expression still calm but edged like a blade that had just cut through years of preparation. Judge Carter's gavel struck again. "This court is in recess for 15 minutes, he announced. The room erupted into noise. Reporters rushed toward the doors, phones lifted to catch glimpses of Levitt and Crockett. Across the aisle, Lawson stood tall, clapping Klein on the back with a jubilant smile as if he'd cheated death. His legal team buzzed with quiet excitement, clearly impressed by Levitt's dismantling of the opposition. Crockett collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands. Her documents, once her strongest case, now looked like worthless scraps in front of her. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "How did she do this?" Across the room, Levitt returned to her seat, meeting Crockett's gaze just long enough to offer a small, unreadable smile. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes said it all. She had flipped the entire trial on its head, and everyone had witnessed it. This wasn't won through emotion or theatrics. It was sheer, unflinching logic that cut deeper than any outburst could. A press secretary, without even a law degree, had transformed a federal courtroom into her arena, and left Jasmine Crockett with nothing but defeat. Judge Carter's gavel still echoed faintly in Crockett's ears. The room buzzed as the press hurried out, and Crockett sat motionless, her thoughts scrambled, her breath shallow. She'd faced shrewd attorneys and hardened judges before, but nothing like this. Not like her. Across the aisle, Lawson chuckled, slapping Klein's shoulder again. "She's a genius," he said, his voice brimming with triumph. Klein nodded, his expression stunned. "I didn't think she'd be this good," he spoke while casting a glance at Levitt. There she stood, petite yet radiating authority, as she exchanged quiet words with a colleague. That faint, confident smirk remained on her face, like this stunning win was just another routine day. Crockett stared at the scene through eyes clouded by rage and humiliation. Lawson beamed across the room, his team nodding with satisfaction. And Levitt, the woman who had just torn her case to shreds, stood at the center of it all, calm and composed. "She's not even a lawyer," Crockett hissed under her breath, her fists clenched. "She's just a press secretary. How the hell does she know all this?" Linda Harris, a longtime colleague and member of her team, stepped beside her and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Jasmine, breathe," she said softly, concern etched into her voice. "This isn't over. We can still fight back." Crockett gave a dry, bitter laugh. "Fight back with what, Linda?" she snapped. "She obliterated everything. The recording, the documents. She referenced United States versus Nixon like she's been in court her whole life." She leaned back in her chair, massaging her forehead. "I underestimated her, and now the whole world knows I did." Linda sat beside her, eyes drifting back to Levitt. "She may not be a lawyer, but she came in with precision," she murmured. "She knew exactly where to strike. Maybe the White House prepared her for this." "The White House," Crockett repeated, venom in her voice. "Trump and his loyal little soldiers. I knew this case had political rot, but I didn't think they'd go this far." She looked again at Levitt, now casually chatting with Klein, her demeanor light, as if the destruction of Crockett's entire case meant nothing. "She's not just defending Lawson. She's defending their entire machine." Outside the courtroom, the chaos of the press filtered in. A reporter's voice echoed from the hallway. "White House press secretary just dismantled Congresswoman Crockett in a federal corruption trial." Another journalist typed frantically, "Caroline Levitt, from spokesperson to courtroom phenomenon in a single day." Crockett heard every word, each one slicing into her pride. She rose, walking slowly to the window, staring out as if fresh air could cleanse the sting of defeat. But she couldn't shake the image of Levitt's cool, calculated gaze. That calm smile etched with power. "I was arrogant," she whispered to herself. "Thought she was just Trump's mouthpiece, but she's a force." Linda joined her by the window, her voice still soft. "We haven't lost everything, Jasmine. The judge is still reviewing. If we can find something—" "No," Crockett interrupted, her voice raw. "You don't get it. She didn't just poke holes in our case, she burned it to ash." I shouted. I slammed the table, and she won, on law, on presence, on everything. Her eyes welled with frustration. "She's not just good, Linda, she's dangerous." Across the room, Levitt finished her quiet conversation with Klein. She glanced at Crockett. No smirk now, just a fleeting look of effortless composure. She didn't need to speak. The victory was written all over the room. Lawson approached and shook Levitt's hand, his voice low with gratitude. "You saved me today," he said. "Trump picked the right one." Levitt offered a faint smile. "I just did my job, Mr. Lawson," she replied evenly, but her eyes betrayed something deeper. She knew she hadn't just defended a man. She'd seized the moment, elevated herself, and made a political statement that echoed far beyond the courtroom walls. Crockett watched, fists clenched at her sides. She turned slowly to Linda, her voice now low but brimming with resolve. "She thinks this is over," she said, "but I'm not done. I won't let Trump's mouthpiece bury me, not like this." Linda nodded, though worry flickered in her eyes. "She's not just a mouthpiece. Jasmine, she's something far more dangerous," Linda whispered. Crockett didn't answer. She stared silently out the courthouse window, the noise of the press swelling outside like a judgment in itself. White House press secretary takes down Congresswoman in court. The words spun inside her skull, repeating like a curse. This wasn't just a courtroom loss. It was a seismic blow to her name, her fight, her pride. Caroline Levitt hadn't just won a case. She had tilted the very air in the courtroom, shifting the balance of power with cold precision. Crockett had lost. That much was undeniable. But somewhere beneath the ache of defeat, something still burned. Her gaze narrowed, her spine straightened. "She's good," she muttered. "But I'll be back." The 15-minute recess passed in a blur for the court, but for Jasmine Crockett it dragged on like a sentence being served. She stood in the hallway of the Dallas Federal Courthouse, gripping a paper cup of water she didn't bother to drink, eyes blankly fixed out the window. Headlines replayed in her mind like a reel on loop. White House press secretary takes down Congresswoman. The sting was fresh, raw. Levitt hadn't just won, she'd dismantled her, made her look like an amateur in front of the entire country. It wasn't just a courtroom victory, it was a public reckoning. The heavy doors creaked. Open and out stepped Caroline Levitt. Dressed in a crisp black suit, her blonde hair catching the hallway light, she moved like someone who owned every step she took. Behind her trailed Charles Lawson and Robert Klein, quietly whispering, but Levitt paid them no mind. She walked to a quiet corner, pulled out her phone and immersed herself in what looked like official messages. Crockett watched her, the plastic cup cracking slightly in her grip. She wanted to look away, to shut out that name, that face, that presence, but something pulled her in. An unspoken challenge, a quiet fury, a strange respect. She set the cup on a bench and walked forward. Each step echoed like a warning across the marble floor. Levitt looked up, unshaken. "Miss Crockett," she said evenly, "I thought you'd left already." Crockett stopped a few feet away, arms folded. For a long moment she simply stared at the woman who had taken her down. But this time the fury had cooled. What remained was clarity. Humbling, bitter clarity. "You're good," she said at last. "I don't want to admit it, but you're damn good. A legal prodigy." Levitt tilted her head slightly. A smirk threatened but didn't stay. She tucked her phone into her pocket, locking eyes with Crockett. "Thanks for the compliment, Miss Crockett," she said, calm but razor sharp. "But I'm not here for praise. I'm here to win." Crockett let out a low, bitter laugh, but this time there was no venom in it. "I see that," she said, her voice sharper now but sincere. "I thought you were just Trump's puppet, a pretty face with a press pass, but I was dead wrong." Levitt didn't blink. Arms crossed, she looked Crockett over, measuring her like an equal. "You're not the first to underestimate me," she said quietly. "And you won't be the last." Crockett nodded slowly. "I lost today," she admitted. "But not because I was unprepared. Because you were too prepared. The Nixon precedent, the subpoena flaw. I don't know where you learned all that, but it's terrifying." A flicker of something human crossed Levitt's face, a faint smile, almost warm. "I learned on the job," she said simply. "When you work for President Trump, You either know everything, or you get eaten alive. Crockett studied her for a beat, a reluctant respect rising in her chest. A normal day, huh? She said, voice thoughtful. If this is normal for you, I don't want to see your best. Leavitt let out a quiet laugh, a brief, unguarded sound that hung in the tension. You'll see it, Miss Crockett, she replied, her eyes glinting. Because I have a feeling this won't be the last time we face each other. Crockett straightened, arms finally dropping to her sides. You're right, she said, voice steady with resolve. Next time I won't go down so easily. I learned my lesson today, and I won't forget it. Leavitt didn't reply. She didn't have to. Her eyes said enough. For a long, heavy moment the two women stood in silence, rivals in every way. Crockett, the seasoned warrior, burning with a sense of justice, and Leavitt, the sharp-edged newcomer, driven by something. Colder, deeper, harder to name opposites, yet somehow equals. From down the hall, the sound of Linda Harris's heels echoed through the stillness, breaking the spell. Jasmine, she called softly, but Crockett didn't move. Not yet. Because she knew. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. We need to get back, Linda called, her voice tight with urgency. The judge is about to rule. Crockett nodded, but her gaze stayed fixed on Caroline Leavitt. See you around, Miss Leavitt, she said quietly, her voice calm but pulsing with meaning. Next time I'll be ready. Leavitt smiled, not smug, not arrogant, just confident. I look forward to it, Miss Crockett. With that, she turned and walked back toward Lawson's legal team, her stride smooth, her demeanor cool, like their fierce confrontation was just another checkbox on her daily to-do list. Crockett watched her go, fists clenched at her sides, jaw tight. Then she turned to Linda, her eyes burning again. She's a genius, she murmured, the words laced with both bitterness and a hard-earned respect. But I won't let her win again. Linda nodded slowly, but her expression was dark with concern. She's not just a genius, Jasmine, she whispered. She's the toughest opponent we've ever faced. Crockett didn't respond. She didn't need to. Instead, she marched back toward the courtroom, head high, heels echoing, the fire inside her burning brighter than before. Caroline Leavitt had won today, but this war, it was far from over. And next time, Crockett would. You ready? Back inside, silence swept through the Dallas federal courthouse as Judge John Carter returned to the bench. With a single ruling, he excluded Crockett's evidence and postponed Charles Lawson's case indefinitely. The damage was done. For now, Leavitt had won. Outside, reporters surged forward, their microphones raised like weapons. But Caroline Leavitt didn't flinch. She exited the courthouse with quiet pride, her expression composed, her posture flawless. She offered no grand speech, only a simple smile, as flash bulbs burst around her. She was no longer just a press secretary. She was something far more dangerous, a rising legal tactician with the full weight of the Trump administration behind her. Across town in the Capitol, Jasmine Crockett sat in her office again, her face harder, her presence sharper. The defeat was a scar, but also a fuel. She sifted through new case files, whispering to Linda Harris, "Next time, I won't let her win." And this time, she meant it. Meanwhile, on White House TV, Caroline Leavitt stood before a sea of cameras at the daily press briefing. A reporter asked about the trial. She smiled, a cool, polished grin. "I just did my job," she said simply. But behind those words sparkled something more, anticipation. She could already see it. Her next clash with Crockett, the next battleground, the next blow in their war. She wasn't done, and neither was Jasmine. This wasn't just a legal fight, it was something deeper. The story of Jasmine Crockett versus Caroline Leavitt is a reflection of modern America, polarized, combative, and fiercely competitive. In today's political and legal arenas, where ideology cuts deep, their courtroom clash wasn't just about a case. It was about identity, about power, about legacy. Crockett, the progressive Democrat waging war against corruption. Leavitt, the sharp, strategic voice of the conservative machine. They weren't just opponents, they were symbols of a nation divided, of brilliance in unexpected places, of a world where sharp minds can come from any side, and the underestimated often rise fastest. Caroline Leavitt had no law degree, but she wielded case law like a sword, citing United States versus Nixon, dismantling Crockett's argument with clinical precision. Her victory sent a message. Titles mean nothing. Preparation means everything, and that's the lesson. In boardrooms, courtrooms, and across the bitter political landscape of America, never underestimate the quiet ones. The ones who don't fit the mold. The ones you think you have figured out. Jasmine Crockett slammed a table in anger. Caroline Leavitt read between the lines of a subpoena. And in that difference, the game was won. So the next time you face a Leavitt, someone who doesn't look like a threat but moves like one, remember Crockett's mistake. Stay sharp, stay calm, and always have a backup plan. Because in this new America, victories don't belong to the loudest. They belong to the smartest. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to catch the next Courtroom Genius. The war isn't over, it's only just begun.